Good morning, everyone. Today we are examining some lessons from Isaiah chapters 52 and 53. And to be honest, these are going to have to be very brief. There is a lot of material that we can pull from these two chapters. As a matter of fact, we could probably sit here for an hour and still not come close to exhausting the lessons and the important factors that we can pull out of these chapters. And so I'm going to do my best to just give some overviews of a few of the things that I see in these chapters very quickly, so that we can have a bit of a grasp of some of the things that are being discussed. And mostly I'm going to hone in on chapter 52 because chapter 53 is so well known. We will have some things to say about it at the end. But because chapter 53 is so familiar to many people, we're going to hone in more on chapter 52 and some of the things that God says here. Remember in verse 1, he talks about this is a call to wake up for Jerusalem. And he makes the statement in verse 3. He says, "For thus says the Lord, you have sold yourselves for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money." Here you have God talking to his people and saying, listen, I'm not the one who has put this upon you. He says, you have sold yourselves for nothing. And when we turn away from God, when we are ones who back away from his commandments, who refuse to follow what he says, we turn after our own desires, we've sold ourselves. And God says you've sold yourself for nothing. You've gotten nothing in return that has made your life better, that has improved your situation. As a matter of fact, look at where you are now. Look at the things that are happening to you now. You have sold yourself and have received in return nothing. And that's what sin does. It causes us to sell ourselves, but there's nothing in return. There is nothing of any value that we can look at and say, yes, this was good for me, or this was worth the price, or this was what it was all for, that I gained something in this area that is going to last beyond a moment. God says you have sold yourselves for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money. In other words, you're not going to make anything. Your redemption is not going to be monetary wealth and riches. It's going to come from a different source. It's going to be of a different type. And so that's the first area I wanted to hone in on. When you drop down to verse number 10, there is an interesting little figure that is made here that I wanted to point out. It stuck out to me both in my original reading of it and as I've gone through and looked at it a little bit more. And that is in verse 10. It says, "The Lord has made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God." If we were to put this into modern terminology, Isaiah here is saying that the Lord has flexed his muscles in the eyes of all the nations. And that's what the idea is of making bare his holy arm, is he is showing his strength. He is flexing his muscles, which is a very interesting and somewhat unique statement to be made about God in the way that God works and how God has acted. But by the things that he has done, or the things that he is going to do in rescuing Israel, and even as you lead into the statements that are made about his servant going into chapter 53, which we know to be the Messiah, we know to be Jesus, that this is the Lord flexing his muscles before all men, about the power that he has, about the ability that he has, and the things that he can do for mankind. And so it's a very interesting and a very satisfying analogy that is being used, that we need to remember what the Lord is doing when the demonstrations of his power and his might and his majesty is not. He's not doing it for his benefit. He's doing it for ours. He's doing it so that we see and we know and we understand who he is and what power he has. Then I want us to drop down to verses 13 through 15. We know that chapter 53 is prophetic of the Messiah, and that it is a message pertaining to the coming of the Christ. And yet, what we sometimes forget is that that message doesn't start in chapter 53. It actually starts at the end of chapter 52. When you get to 52 verse 13, he says, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him. For what had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider." And so before he gets into the pictures of who Jesus was and who Jesus would be, you have these statements concerning what he would be. Yes, he is going to be exalted and extolled and be very high, but he is going to have a visage, an appearance that is going to be marred more than any man, speaking of the cross and the things that he will endure there. But then you get to verse 15, and you have the pictures of him sprinkling many nations, of kings shutting their mouths, in other words, having no response to him for the things that he says and for the commandments that he's going to give, for the law that he's going to lay forth. And certainly you see that in the trial of Jesus, but you also see that in the proclamations of Jesus that are going to go forward into the book of Acts and things of that nature, when they would stand before kings and they would present Jesus before them. For what they had not been told them, or what had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider. And so there's going to be something very unique about this Jesus. As you come into chapter 53, there are so many beautiful pictures that are being placed before us by Isaiah. And you have the picture of who Jesus is in verse number 2. "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." In other words, he is going to be a very plain, simple man. He is not going to be one who is going to demand attention and turn heads just because he walked into the room. As a matter of fact, that is one of the reasons why during his life there are going to be so many people that are not going to recognize Jesus. He doesn't have this rememberable face just to see him. He doesn't stand out in a crowd. He looks like an average, ordinary, everyday guy. There's nothing that would just make somebody turn and look and say, "That's a good-looking guy. I think I'm going to follow him." That's not the way Jesus appeared, because he didn't want people following him because of the way that he looked. He wanted people to follow him because of who he was and what he did. He is despised and rejected of men. Verse 4 or verse 3. "He has borne our griefs and our sorrows." Verse 4. "He was wounded for our transgressions." Verse 5. "And by his stripes we are healed. He was oppressed and he was afflicted." Verse 7. "Yet he opened not his mouth." All of these things Jesus endured for us. All of these things he was willing to go through so that we might have the hope of salvation. And then in verse 11 it says, "He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied." Ultimately, it was worth it. That's what I have for today from Isaiah 52 and 53. I know there's a lot more that we could talk about and a lot more depth we could go into. But tomorrow, we will jump into Isaiah chapter 54 and examine some things about it. Until then, have a great day.